Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about the presuppositional approach to apologetics applied to Wicca. That's right, to Wicca, witchcraft. As we always mention on this channel, every perspective comes from a specific worldview perspective. And so much of what we do on this channel is kind of like what we might call worldview analysis. Doesn't matter what perspective someone comes from. Now, you guys know that I'm quite convinced that the presuppositional method to apologetics is the biblical approach, whether we call it presuppositional apologetics, revealed apologetics, or covenantal apologetics. The reality is that we seek to take the apologetic methodology from Scripture and apply it to all areas of life. Here's the rub of it. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, the Apostle Peter commands us to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's in us, if anyone should ask for the reason for the hope that's within us, doing so with gentleness and respect. Now, the Apostle Peter is not talking about, he's not talking to scholars. His audience is not primarily a scholarly audience by any means. He's talking to anyone. So regardless, if you are a Christian scholar, a Christian layperson, you ought to be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within you, whether you're talking to a college professor, a Muslim, a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, a Satanist, or a Wiccan. So the reality is we all need to be ready. And the way that we're ready is that we are well grounded in biblical truth. We know what the Bible teaches. We know how to express it. We know where in the Bible such and such doctrines are taught so that we can support what we say with the Word of God. And we stand on the authority of God, showing and demonstrating the foolishness and absurdity of all forms of unbelief. As Dr. Cornelius Van Til often stressed, that there are only two worldviews. There is the Christian worldview and the non-Christian worldview. Now, granted, there are many worldviews under the category of non-Christian worldview, but they all share the similarity of not being the Christian one, or they explicitly or implicitly deny the Christian God. So when it boils down to it, the kind of critique that we're going to be offering is going to be very similar to how we would critique any manifestation or form of the non-Christian perspective. So Wicca is the same thing. And how do you apply presup to a Wiccan? Well, you apply presup to a Wiccan in the exact same way you apply it to the atheist, in the exact same way you apply it to the agnostic, in the exact same way you apply it to the Muslim. It's the same thing. We do it at a worldview level. We stay away from categories of autonomy and neutrality, as it is unbiblical and philosophically vacuous. And we engage with worldview comparison and analysis. We give the positive demonstration that given the Christian worldview, given Christian presuppositions, knowledge, science, intelligible experience is accounted for, and given the contender to Christianity, whether it's atheism, agnosticism, Islam, Mormonism, or whatever, or Wicca, those views are reduced to absurdity, whether it's through showing inconsistency or not providing the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience or knowledge or logic or anything along those lines. That's what's going to be the basic overall approach that we're going to take with regardless of whom we are speaking with. Now, in the context of this video, we're going to be talking about Wicca. If you're interested in this topic, I do have another video where I interviewed Matt Slick of carm.org, who has a lot of experience in this particular field. He is a Christian apologist. Most of the people watching this channel know who he is. He's been on the channel many times. And of course, everyone's familiar with his website, carm.org. But he was in the occult prior to becoming a Christian. So he has some background in that particular area. There's an entire section on carm.org that covers Wicca and a whole host of information, what it is, what to look out for, what kinds of questions you should ask a Wiccan, so on and so forth. So lots of material there. And so I will try to remember, I always forget, but I'll try to remember to put that previous interview that I had with Matt Slick years ago in the description of this video so that you can watch that as well, because it was a very, very interesting discussion. Nevertheless, this particular topic hit home for me because when I was doing my undergrad, so I have 4 college degrees, okay? So I'm in lots of debt, okay? That was very expensive. I have an associate's degree in liberal arts, and then I have a bachelor's degree in secondary education and history. So I was a social studies teacher in the public school, and I taught history at the Christian private school level as well. And then I have 2 masters in theological studies from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, when I was going to school for my secondary education bachelor's degree, Okay. It was here at this particular school where I met this girl. Her name was, I think it was Victoria. We were friends, but we weren't we weren't super close. So I think her name's Victoria. But I remember even in those early years, I was still into apologetics, and I often tried to share my faith on the campus and so forth. And I remember becoming really good friends with this girl, just casual. Scratch that. Not when I was going for my bachelor's, because this was before I met my wife. Okay, so there you go. So I was hanging out with some random girl. It was actually when I was going to school at community college. So I went to Suffolk Community College in Long Island. It was there where I met Victoria. Okay, got my history messed up. How many people do that? You ever tell a story and you kind of mix time periods together? I'm getting old. I'm 43 going on 79. Nevertheless, so I'm going for my associate's degree at Suffolk Community College. I meet this girl, just casual. We kind of just talk, and I noticed that she seemed to be very into religion and so forth. And as we had various conversations, because we used to be, I have a theater background, so those who know me in person know that I tend to be very theatrical and animated. That comes from my theater background, because I used to, before I got into apologetics, I wanted to be an actor. So I wanted to get into the movies and things like that. So I took theater classes, acting classes, so on and so forth. And the program that I had that was there in the school that I went to was really good. The teacher that I had for my acting class actually went to school with Dustin Hoffman, if you guys are familiar. So they had a really good acting program. But anyway, we used to hang out there all the time. People used to talk in the lobby and stuff about all sorts of things. So nevertheless, Victoria, once we started talking about religion, she learned very quickly that I was a Christian, and she had all sorts of questions about Christianity. She was one of those seekers. She asked lots of questions, expressed great interest in religion in general, but specifically in her personal practice, she identified as a Wiccan. And so I didn't know much about Wicca at the time. And she used to bring on campus, she'd bring with her this little black box of crystals. And I used to think this was so wonky, and we'll talk about this later on in this video, but she used to bring these crystals and tell me this crystal means this, and this has this property, so on and so forth. And I remember having conversations where it's like, well, how do you know that that's true? Even back then, I was asking these questions. How do you know that you're not being deceived and all these kinds of things? And then, of course, I would try my best to answer all of her questions. And it was really respectful, right? When you think of like Wicca, you tend to think of like dark and like, oh, those people are really strange. This girl was just really nice. We used to have really good conversations, and it always ended well. But I got to learn a lot about, where she was coming from. And of course, I often challenged her worldview, because back then I was doing apologetics as well, to the point where she really considered like, wow, like, I think she said something like, well, I know Christianity has more answers than my perspective, and then she kind of gave her reasons why she wasn't a Christian. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. But it was very interesting. So all that to say, Wicca, while not a major focus in my own personal studies, was always of interest to me because I actually knew a Wiccan back in the day, and we'd had really good conversations about religion, faith, and all these sorts of things. So that's the reason why I wanted to cover it today in this particular video. However, before we kind of jump into applying a presuppositional or a biblical or a covenantal apologetic to the specific worldview of Wicca, and it is a worldview, to be sure, we need to kind of lay the groundwork and kind of lay out what exactly is Wicca. What do Wiccans believe? Because if we don't understand their worldview accurately, we really can't engage them in a meaningful way. And so I tell that story of Victoria because my experience with Wiccans was super respectful, super nice. So don't be afraid to confront someone who identifies as Wiccan. Maybe they have certain symbols that are associated with what we tend to think of as Christians, like, oh, that's occultic and so forth. Don't be afraid to engage in conversation, all right? Because you never know where God will open doors and give you the opportunity to create important relationships that over time you have an opportunity to both live out, proclaim, and defend the gospel. So very, very important. So what is Wicca? Wicca is, we can understand Wicca as a modern neo-pagan religion. It started gaining popularity in the mid-20th century, though it claims inspiration from much older pagan, nature-centered traditions. This is one of the things you want to keep in mind about Wicca. Wicca is a very nature-based religion, okay? And one of the first things that you want to know about Wicca is that Wiccans don't have a pope or a central authority or, even a single creed that we can point to that all Wiccans agree upon. What you need to understand about Wicca as a perspective is that it is very, very individualistic. You're going to find lots of variation from one Wiccan coven to another. A coven is like a group or something where you could have a coven, a group of witches gathering together. But there are still, a lot of common threads that most Wiccans would affirm. So what you want to keep in mind is when you're dealing with Wicca, there's differentiation, distinction, and nuance. But there are some general points that most Wiccans would agree upon. But again, differences, there are different traditions, different things that go back to different roots and so forth. You want to be familiar with it. All of it unbiblical and totally makes someone a prime candidate for evangelism. Okay, that's another thing you want to know. But at the heart of Wicca is the belief in something called the one or the all. Okay, and don't think in terms of like the Force of Star Wars. When you think of Wicca, you're going to find very Eastern overtones, a lot pertaining to like pantheistic or panentheistic perspectives. So they often believe in this thing called the one or the all. And you can think of it as kind of like an impersonal divine energy that is the universe. It's not outside of it like the God of Christianity, where we talk about God being transcendent from the universe. From the all, Wiccans believe that two personal deities emerge. You have the God and the goddess. And I talk about this with Matt Slick in our interview on Wicca, where he goes into a little bit more detail about this concept of the God and the goddess, okay? Now, these two are seen as complementary, pretty much balancing masculine and feminine energies in the world, and they're believed to show up in different forms throughout nature. And this is why nature is very, very important to the Wiccan, okay? Nature itself for the Wiccan is sacred. Okay, and they'll often, hear this in conversations with them. The trees, the wind, the moon, the tides, all of this is viewed as alive with divine energy. So worship in Wicca often looks like honoring those natural cycles. There'll be appeals to like seasonal cycles and so forth. Rituals and ceremonies, all of these things are meant to help the particular Wiccan stay in tune with how would they express it? Maybe they stay in tune with the natural order, if that makes sense. The turning of the seasons, the phases of the moon, a lot of things like that. Okay, so think nature-based, nature-oriented, nature is sacred, these sorts of things. And of course, that's why a lot of Wiccans who do kind of like, social justice-y kind of things, we call it social justice, I suppose, environmental kinds of things. They are advocates for the environment, so on and so forth, which is good. Christians should be advocates for the environment, but from within a biblical perspective. Obviously, we're going to have different reasons as to why nature needs to be honored, taken care of, so on and so forth. Now, Wiccans also tend to believe that divinity isn't just, something out there. It's something in here. In other words, every person, every individual has a spark of the divine within themselves. And again, this should sound familiar to you. It's very Eastern, very New Agey, although there's some differentiation, right? And that's why they often emphasize the notion of personal autonomy and what some refer to as self-discovery. They'll say that everyone's path to truth might look different, and that's okay as long as it doesn't harm anyone. Now, that idea of harming is going to be a very important concept in just a bit. You want to keep that in mind. We'll come back to it in just a moment. But most Wiccans accept the idea of evolution, biological evolution, notions of reincarnation, even concepts of like karma, which again, very Eastern in its orientation. I mean, prior to doing this particular video that I'm doing now, I did a video on Hinduism. And Hinduism, of course, has a notion of karma. And you see Hinduism, Buddhism, this idea of karma, reincarnation, so on and so forth is a common thread in a lot of Eastern thought. But nevertheless, they believe that when someone dies, for example, their spirit goes to a place called Summerland, okay? Or Summerland, I don't know how they pronounce it, but it's kind of like a peaceful resting place before someone is reborn, right? Because remember that idea of reincarnation. And over time, through many lives that are experienced, you supposedly grow and learn from your actions and the good and the bad, all these sorts of things. That's where the concept of karma comes in. And again, very, very familiar if you are already familiar with kind of that Eastern thought, okay? Now, the interesting thing with Wicca is that when it comes to morality, okay, Wiccans usually live by one main ethical guideline, which is often associated with what's called the Wiccan Rede. The Wiccan Rede. Again, in my interview with Matt Slick, we talk a little bit about this, but the Wiccan Rede pretty much says, "And it harm none, do what ye will." In other words, do what you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. That's the Wiccan Rede. So there is a notion of morality, but don't get it mixed up with, say, something that might be held in like Islam, where there's a standard of morality. Obviously we would disagree with that standard, but you get what I'm saying. It's not the same, okay? But they do have this moral principle known as the Wiccan Rede. Pretty much do what you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. We'll come back to that because that point right there is going to be a good foundation for apologetic discourse when you're speaking to a Wiccan. So within Wicca, there is a strong focus on personal responsibility and the idea of balance. Okay? So I hope I'm not going too fast. I hope that kind of makes sense. All right? Now, alongside those affirmations, there's also several key denials in Wiccan thought. For example, Wiccans deny biblical ideas like heaven and hell. They also deny the existence of the devil or Satan, despite, contrary to popular opinion, Wicca is not devil. It's not the equivalent to devil worship in like a satanic, like Satanism. There's a difference between Wicca and Satanism. Both are ungodly, but they are not directly linked in ways that are sometimes popularly thought of Wiccans. Okay, so there is a distinction. If you call a Wiccan a Satanist, well, Satanism as an organized religion itself with a set of beliefs and so forth, it's not equated to Wicca. They don't believe the same things. So you want to be careful to make that distinction. We'll try to disambiguate that confusion a little bit later in the video. Okay, but most Wiccans find the idea, if you call them, devil worshippers and things, they might find that offensive because they don't even believe in Satan. So, you might make the argument that because they're not serving God or they place maybe worship in nature or gods and goddesses, that they're worshiping Satan in that sense. But in an explicit sense, they don't affirm the existence of a biblical Satan or anything along those lines. So you want to make sure that when you are interacting with a Wiccan, allow them to define their own categories and go with that. Okay, don't take your preconceived notions of what you think they believe, impose that upon them, and then critique that. You want to be open and honest and desire clarity in communication, allowing them to kind of define their own terms, just as you would like to define your own terms as well. A lot of Wiccans, at least in my experience, often have had religious background, that they maybe grew up in church or something like that. And so they too have preconceived notions of Christianity. You don't want them to foist their misrepresentations of Christianity based on their bad experiences. You don't want them to foist that upon you. You want them to understand your perspective as you present it, right? Not based upon preconceived notions and things like that. Another thing to keep in mind about Wicca is that Wiccans tend to deny the idea of absolute evil or absolutes in general. Okay, so instead of things like good and evil, right? Good and evil are seen as relative. What matters the most is not these kind of the dichotomy that we typically make, but it's an issue of balance. It's an issue of intention and harmony. Wiccans reject the authority of the Bible and the inspiration of the Bible or the need for salvation, and the claim that Jesus is the only way to God. Okay, they're going to reject that, to be sure. Okay, as kind of a narrow-minded view. Wiccans tend to be relativistic when you kind of ask those deeper questions. They often reject moral absolutes, concepts of male headship, which makes sense because witches are female, as opposed to like a male witch, which I think we might witch we might refer to. I think they call them warlocks or something like. I'm not familiar with all of the terminology, but nevertheless, they tend to reject moral absolutes, male headship, and any kind of, what might be understood as religious hierarchy. And the idea that humanity was commanded to subdue the earth, that biblical concept. Instead, they see the earth as something to care for and live in harmony with. Again, sounds nice, but within the worldview context, it obviously has problems, and it is inconsistent with the Christian worldview. Now, with like a normal conversation, we can laud the Wiccan and say, I'm happy that you value nature. I, as a Christian, value nature as well. That's a good common ground, okay, between yourself, the Christian, and the Wiccan. But again, you always want to remember worldview context, right? There's a touch point with the unbeliever, but you're gonna need to be very careful with the fact that while you respect nature as a Christian and they respect nature as a Wiccan, you don't respect nature for the same exact reasons. So you want to always make sure you keep those differentiations in mind, lest you fall victim to speaking to the Wiccan in neutral categories. It's like, well, this person this person values nature, or I value nature. So look, there's the neutral ground. No. It's common ground. It's not neutral ground. Okay. The way that they value nature from your Christian perspective and your biblical commitment is idolatrous. So you don't want to give way to that kind of thinking. All right. So to summarize, and we're not done, but to summarize, Wicca is a nature-based, pantheistic, sometimes panentheistic kind of worldview. Remember, pantheism is all is God. Panentheism is the world is within God. Okay, that's different. From a Christian worldview perspective, where we make the distinction between the creator and the creature, okay, we have a creator-creature distinction. There's a creator, God creates. There's a distinction between the maker and that which is made. Those lines are blurred, so you'll see an unbelieving thought, at least in this specific manifestation of it, there's a blurring of that line between creator and creature, okay? Because divinity is found within the universe rather than above it or beyond it or differentiated from it. Wiccans tend to celebrate conceptions of balance, personal freedom, and harmony with the natural world rather than a submission to divine revelation as the Christian sees it, okay? So all of these are kind of just important touch points to keep in mind when trying to understand where the Wiccan is coming from. Now, there are a lot of questions that pop in your head when you hear someone kind of lay out these beliefs. Well, if they believe this, then what about that? That's good. You want to think like that. When someone says, this is what I believe, you want to ask those questions. Keep those questions in your mind, and when you have opportunity, ask those questions. Well, if you believe in no absolutes, then what's up with the Wiccan read, and what's up with the... You want to think along those categories. Very, very important. So, sorry, let me turn that off. There we go. So, let's pause for a moment here, and I want to expand on what we mentioned earlier, this concept of the Wiccan read. Very, very important in Wiccan thought. And this is basically the central, we can call it a moral guideline in Wicca. And it's summed up in that short phrase that I mentioned before, and in harm none, do what ye will. Okay? Now, that sounds kind of old school the way it's said there, but it simply means, as I mentioned before, as long as you're not hurting anyone, do whatever you want. Okay? Now notice the flexibility that particular phrase and principle warrants. There's a whole host of things that we as Christians would say is complete and utter evil that someone could try to shove in that principle. You want to be very mindful of that. Okay? So again, for most Wiccans, okay, this particular concept, the Wiccan read, reflects the religion's emphasis on personal freedom and individual responsibility. That's very, very important to Wiccans. Now, that sounds kind of harmless and even noble, right? If you're going to do something, don't harm anyone, okay? After all, who doesn't want to live in that way, right? You want to avoid harming other people. But in Wicca, this phrase carries a lot more philosophical weight. Okay, it's not just a call to, kindness, let's be nice, right? It's a statement about the nature of morality itself. The read assumes that moral right and wrong are determined by consequences and intentions rather than by any kind of divine command or revealed moral law. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind. It's morality is determined by, right and wrong is determined by consequences and intentions. All right, you want to challenge those from a non-Christian perspective. Okay, so in practice, Wiccans often interpret the read in one of two ways. Some take it as kind of in a very individualistic sense. As long as my actions don't cause harm, I'm free to pursue whatever path feels right to me. And in this view, if you think about it, morality becomes very subjective, right? What's harm to one person might not be harm to another person. And so everyone kind of defines that, that concept for themselves. That is a very important apologetic touch point. If you believe you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm, well, who gets to define what constitutes as harm? That's a great question to ask. All right. And so, when we do apologetics, we talk about all these philosophical concepts and philosophical argumentation and transcendental this and necessary preconditions for that, so on and so forth. But a lot of the discussions are going to be rooted in kind of issues of ethics and things like that. So you want to be somewhat able to navigate those kind of ethical sorts of discussions. Okay, very, very important. Now, when you talk to other Wiccans, others have a more communal view of that, right? They might say, because we're all interconnected, humans, animals, nature, we should act in ways that preserve harmony and balance in the natural order. So here, in this particular view, the focus isn't on a personal code as much as it's on maintaining equilibrium in the web of life, if we can use that type of terminology. Now, either way, what you end up with is a moral framework, and this is for apologetic relevance here. What you have is a moral framework rooted in relativism and naturalism. Okay, it's relativistic because what's right or wrong depends on individual judgment or maintaining balance rather than on a command of a lawgiver or whatever. It's naturalistic because it's grounded in the natural world and human intuition rather than divine revelation. So when Wiccans say, harm none, they're not appealing to an absolute standard of good and evil revealed by a God. They're appealing to a kind of cosmic or karmic equilibrium. Okay, the idea is that every action creates ripples in the universe, and those ripples eventually return back to you, for better or for worse. And so this ties in very closely with the Wiccan concept of karma and the what's called the threefold law, which teaches that whatever energy you put out into the world, whether it's good or bad, it's going to return to you 3 times over. Okay? Again, sometimes you hear Christians talking like this. It's terrible, right? It's so interesting to see how a lot of these ideas have seeped into popular culture at various levels. Sometimes within the church, pop culture, movies, shows, so on and so forth. You want to be able to recognize it. Now, in that sense, morality in Wicca isn't about obedience to God, right? Or the god or the goddesses or whatever. But it's about energy, consequences, self-correction, self-growth. It's about aligning yourself with what's perceived as the natural balance of the universe rather than conforming to a divine moral standard. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. But they will slip, okay? In my conversations, they'll say these things, but then they don't act consistently with it, and so, oh, that's injustice. Well, maybe this person didn't interpret harm the way that you do, right? You always want to go back to that objective standard, okay? Any view that rejects moral absolutes, like there's objective morality or objective values and duties, there's apologetic value in pointing out the inconsistencies, because people say that. It's very easy to say that with your mouth, but people don't live consistently with the denial of those things, okay? Now, from a presuppositional perspective, all of this raises really important questions that you need to be keeping in mind, and questions that we're going to unpack in just a bit, but think about it. If morality is purely a matter of balance or personal interpretation, okay, this is the question we want to ask. What foundation does the Wiccan have for saying that harm itself is even wrong? Right? Harm none. What does harm mean in a worldview where there's no absolute lawgiver? No absolute distinction between good and evil. You got that pantheism, right? That monism. No transcendent moral standard. Okay? Those are the kinds of questions we'll need to press when we have conversations with these individuals. Okay? You want to start analyzing Wicca's ethical framework in light of the Christian worldview. Okay? And offer that internal critique. If what you're saying is true, Mr. or Miss Wiccan or Mr. Wiccan or whoever, what results from that? Okay, that's the internal critique aspect. Now, when we talk about worldviews, and I mentioned this before when I did the video on Hinduism, I like to put the three buckets of every worldview in front of me. It's kind of a mental picture. I got bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3. Every worldview has these three foundations: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. Metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Every worldview has a theory of what they think is real and possible and impossible, a theory of how we come to know what we know, and a theory of how we should live our lives, okay? And so when I'm talking to the Wiccan, I'm thinking of those three categories. My questions are geared towards identifying their beliefs and putting them into these categories. Now, I have these categories in mind. Not every Wiccan is going to be, as Van Til says, epistemologically self-conscious. Okay, we use the fancy words. Not everyone is aware of the philosophical backdrop that impacts what they believe and how they interpret reality. So not everyone's aware of the fact that they have or are operating, under a worldview framework. Some people are, and it's very sophisticated and nuanced, and other people have no clue that they're operating under these particular issues. But you as the Christian, you need to be epistemologically self-conscious. You need to be aware of the worldview categories and what role those categories play in rational discourse, debate, and disagreement, and worldview analysis, so on and so forth. Very, very important. Now, if we take a step back, okay, think in terms of those buckets. If we think of a Wiccan perspective, what is the Wiccan metaphysic? That is, what do Wiccans believe about the nature of reality itself? Because before we can evaluate a worldview, you need to understand what kind of world it says we're living in. That makes sense? Very, very important. So I want to know, what does this person believe about the nature of reality? That's the metaphysical question. And then I want to pivot to the epistemological question. So I ask a metaphysical question, or I allow the person to state their metaphysic, and then I pivot to an epistemological. So let's say the nature of reality is this. There's the one, there's the all, there's the God and the goddesses, and the epistemological twist. How do you know? How do you know that? Right? These are important because remember, they don't believe in revelation in the way that Christians do. So there's going to be some level of intellectual autonomy and neutral categories that we can press and critique. And I won't get into that in this video, but you get the point. Those are important things to look for when you are having these types of conversations. Now, for the Wiccan, reality is fundamentally divine and interconnected. Okay, everything that exists, the trees, the oceans, the stars, the animals, and yes, even you and me, we're seen as part of a single living whole. And this is often referred to, as we made mention before, the one or the all. Again, it's not a personal God who stands outside of creation. Okay, it's more like a divine energy or a divine life force that is creation. Okay, you could say that the Wicca sees the universe as God itself. That's that pantheism, right? And this is why Wicca is often described as pantheistic or panentheistic. So again, I've mentioned those words. You want to keep those in mind. So pantheism literally means all is God. And in distinction to that, you have panentheism, which means that God is in everything, or the world is in God, something along those lines. And so you want to, all this to say, they do not make the proper creator-creature distinction as we would see it. Okay, they have a different perspective there. Now, within this divine whole that they hold to, Wiccans usually recognize two main personal aspects of divinity, which we mentioned before as the god and the goddess. And these two are seen as complementary forces representing masculine and feminine energy in balance. Okay, that's an important concept. They're not supreme beings ruling over the universe so much as how we can say that, personifications of the energies that are in the universe, if that makes sense. So when a Wiccan talks about the god or the goddess, they're not talking about like a transcendent deity who commands or judges or anything like that. They're talking about expressions of the natural and spiritual rhythms within reality itself. The light, the dark, life and death, the changing of the seasons, fertility, decay, rebirth, these sorts of things, okay? And this is why nature plays such a central role in the Wiccan mindset. Because if everything is divine, If the trees, the moon, and even your own body are all manifestations of the all, then to be in harmony with nature is to be in harmony with the divine, right? Rituals, ceremonies, seasonal festivals within the Wiccan religion, they're really all about aligning yourself with these natural cycles and energies. You might say that Wicca, worship isn't about how we would see it. Okay, they don't see it as an acknowledgement of like a personal higher authority. It's about participating in a living cosmos. Okay, we are part of the cosmos. Now, this metaphysical picture, again, as all metaphysical pictures, have huge implications. Think about it. It means that in Wicca, reality has no ultimate personal foundation. Okay, this is complete opposite of Christianity. For Christianity, the fundamental metaphysical starting point is the creator-creature distinction. The ultimate foundation of all reality for the Christian is personal. And so their metaphysic is that there is a fundamental, ultimate impersonality. There isn't a creator who exists independently of creation. Existence itself just is divine. Reality is viewed as a great web of energy, endlessly cycling through life, death, rebirth, all these sorts of things. And all things are ultimately one. It's part of the all. Okay. And so, again, as I said before, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but there is the blurring of the lines of the creator-creature distinction. Now, this is also why reincarnation fits naturally into a Wiccan worldview, and we typically associate that with like Hinduism and Eastern thought. If everything is part of one continuous divine energy, then your individual life is just one temporary expression of that larger whole. And so, in essence, when you die, you don't go to heaven, you don't go to hell. Remember, Wiccans deny that, right? Your energy simply returns to the universal source, okay, or Summerland. And it's eventually recycled into a new life. So you have that kind of round and round you go. And so the Wiccan metaphysic teaches that everything is divine, everything's connected, everything is in motion, reality is cyclical rather than linear, immanent rather than transcendent, and impersonal rather than personal. Okay. Now I like the distinction between cyclical and linear. I mean, this is a very different conception of reality. The Christianity tends to see history, the unfolding as history, as something that is linear. In other words, there is an absolute beginning point of creation, and then all of history is moving towards a telos, a goal, a designed purpose and end. Whereas when you have these Eastern religious perspectives, everything is more cyclical in nature. All right. And so it's not more of a beginning point moving to a certain direction, but is this endless process of cycles. Now, again, from a worldview perspective, that is going to, we can critique these things, which we're going to do in just a moment. But from a Christian and presuppositional perspective, this is going to raise some really important questions. If everything is divine, okay, what does it even mean to call something good or evil or right or wrong, right? If all distinctions ultimately dissolve into what they call the all, then how can Wicca make sense of the very differences that it kind of emphasizes, right? Male and female, light and darkness, life and death. How do you make sense of these things, right? Press for consistency. Those are the kinds of issues that we need to unpack a little bit more. But what I want to show is that this worldview does not provide, if you take the metaphysic, the epistemology, which tends to really rely on like intuition and personal experience, very subjective, the worldview does not have the ingredients that can provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience. So you can apply a presuppositional analysis to this particular perspective. Okay. So now that we got that part out of the way, how do we do that? All right. I'm going to ask the question, and I asked this question before of Hinduism, and you're going to ask the question again now. Okay. Can this worldview, the Wiccan worldview, actually account for the very things it claims to explain? Okay. Because remember, presuppositional apologetics is not simply to set side by side the Christian worldview and the non-Christian worldview and say, look, they're different. No, it's about showing that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can make sense out of knowledge, intelligible experience, science, all of the things that people take for granted. Christianity has what it takes to give that a proper context for meaning. The Wiccan worldview cannot. The Hindu worldview cannot. The Muslim worldview cannot. Buddhist worldview cannot. They all crumble and don't pay the bills on the claims of the worldview. All right? So let's take a look here. Okay? In Wicca, as we mentioned before, all is one. Okay? The divine is not distinct from the world, but identical with it. All right. Nature, humanity, and the divine, they're all just different expressions of the same universal energy. Now, that sounds nice, but again, there's going to be problems. Again, if we need to think about this. If everything is divine, then nothing truly is. If the term divine applies equally to you, to a rock, to a tree, to a mosquito, then the word loses all meaningful distinction, doesn't it? There's no longer a creator-creature relationship. There's just one big undifferentiated all, which is what they affirm. But if there's no real distinction between creator and creation, then there's no foundation for meaning, no foundation for morality, no foundation for rationality. Everything simply is. Nothing has any ultimate explanation. You're reduced to kind of a brute factuality. Now, in the Christian metaphysic, we have a clear and necessary creator-creature distinction. God is not the world. The world is not God. He is independent, self-existent. He is the I am of Scripture, Exodus 3:14. And everything else derives its being from him. And that distinction gives reality its structure and its intelligibility, because God is the ultimate unity, one in essence, three in persons, and his creation is diverse yet ordered. The world reflects both the unity and diversity in harmony. There's where you have the necessary Trinitarian foundation at a metaphysical level that the Christian worldview provides that no other worldview can. And we talked about this in Hinduism. If Hinduism posits an ultimate oneness, then differentiation becomes illusory. But if differentiation and differences become illusory, then you lose the foundation for knowledge and logic, because knowledge and logic presuppose that differentiation. Okay, so Wicca does not provide the necessary preconditions for unity and plurality in the world. Okay, it blurs unity and diversity into kind of this amorphous oneness that makes no differentiations. Okay, it makes the mistakes that a lot of the philosophical perspectives of the pre-Socratic philosophers made. Okay, check out my video on the problem of the one and the many, where I had Brant Bosterman on for a 2-hour discussion breaking this down. Very, very interesting stuff. So the Wiccan metaphysic, okay, while claiming to kind of have explanations for things, it actually destroys the very precondition for explanation itself. It erases the categories that makes understanding possible. In other words, if the picture of reality put forth by Wicca is true, knowledge is undermined, because it removes distinctions of which knowledge must presuppose, a necessary precondition for knowledge. All right, let's take morality. We mentioned it before with the Wiccan Reed. And it harm none, do what ye will. But in a worldview where all is one, what does it mean to harm something? Right? If the killer and the victim are both expressions of the all, then harm is simply one part of the larger cosmic balance, isn't it? Right? It can't be ultimately wrong. It's just another movement in the cycle. And so morality becomes not a matter of good versus evil on the Wiccan perspective, but of shifting energies, which means there's no real ought or ought not on that view. Now, within the Christian worldview, again, we're doing the worldview comparison here, morality is grounded in the very character of God. Goodness is not an impersonal energy. It's a reflection of a personal, holy being. Evil is not an imbalance, but it's personal rebellion. Okay? Without the transcendent moral lawgiver, moral categories lose any objective meaning. Wicca can say, will harm none, right? But it cannot explain why harming is wrong in the first place. In a world where everything's divine and nothing's ultimately distinct, how do you make sense out of the concept of harm? What about knowledge? In the Wiccan view, truth is experiential and relative. Every path is as valid as another path as long as it works for the individual and doesn't harm another person. But again, if truth is relative, then contradiction becomes acceptable and rationality is going to collapse at that point. The very concept of knowledge assumes an objective reality that remains the same whether you believe it or not. But Wicca denies that kind of objectivity because it denies a transcendent mind who orders and sustains reality. Not so with Christian theism. Christian theism, in Christianity, knowledge has meaning because we are creatures made in the image of God. We're made in the image of the omniscient God. We can know things truly, not exhaustively, that's not what we're saying, but we can know things truly because God has revealed himself and his creation to us. Revelation, not intuition or ritual, as you see in the Wiccan perspective. Revelation grounds our knowledge of the world. And this is why we hold to what we call a revelational epistemology. And so when the Wiccan speaks of balance, harmony, and personal enlightenment, or however they describe it, what they're doing is they're borrowing language that only makes sense in a world created and governed by the God of Scripture. They talk about moral responsibility, they talk about energy, they talk about order, beauty, and nature, so on and so forth. But those concepts presuppose what? They presuppose a rational, moral, and personal source of order. Wicca has none of that. It borrows Christian capital, okay? The very categories of truth, the very categories of goodness and beauty, they borrow from that while denying the God who makes those categories meaningful. They reject the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, whether they know it or not, okay? And this is why Van Til used to say that the unbeliever lives in borrowed territory. The Wiccan can garden, the Wiccan can love, create art, talk about right and wrong, all of these things, all of which are beautiful reflections of God's world, but they can't justify any of it from within their system. So the presuppositional refutation of Wicca, if we could summarize it, looks like this. Metaphysically, okay, Wicca collapses unity and diversity into an incoherent oneness. So you have the problem of the one and the many. Only the triune God of Scripture accounts for both unity and diversity without the confusion. Okay, we talked about that in another video in more detail. Epistemologically, Wicca grounds knowledge and intuition and experience, which are subjective and changing. Only revelation from an unchanging God provides a foundation for truth. We could argue that. Ethically, Wicca affirms moral responsibility but denies any absolute standard. Only the holy nature of God gives morality, meaning, and obligation. Okay, so even their Wiccan Reed has no foundation. It's very subjective. And so when you press the Wicca Wiccans, when you press Wicca, that's what I was going to say, okay, to his logical conclusion, it cannot justify the very reality that it presupposes. It exalts nature, but it can't explain its order. It praises balance, but it can't ground distinction between harmony and chaos. It seeks knowledge, but denies the only foundation that makes knowledge possible. So once again, we find that the Christian worldview alone, grounded in the self-revealing triune God who's revealed himself both in general and special revelation, provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. The heavens declare the glory of God, not this impersonal, this impersonal all. The order of nature reflects a personal creator, not an amorphous cosmic energy. And the moral law written on our hearts, Romans 2:15, very important, points to the law of God written in our hearts, not in this kind of impersonal cycle of karma. Okay? So the Wiccan kneels before nature. What they're doing unknowingly is standing in the temple of the true and living God. The beauty, the order, the rhythm that they love in creation are echoes of the divine craftsmen who they know, but are suppressing the truth about in their unrighteousness. Okay? Very, very important. So you want to bring these things out. The Wiccan is created in the image of God, and so the apologetic task is to expose the suppression of that image. The very things that they know in their heart of hearts are being suppressed and being expressed. Their rebellion is being expressed in the form of Wiccan ritual. You want to be able to go beyond that and strike at the foundations. Now, one last thing that I think is important, then I'll kind of wrap things up. I think it's important to address the issue of Wicca and Satanism, okay? And this is one of the biggest misconceptions that people had, and I made mention of it a little bit earlier, okay? You'll often hear folks, especially from Christian circles, Christians will have this misconception. They'll automatically associate Wicca with devil worship and the occult and so forth, okay? Now, again, is Wicca evil? Yes, Wicca's evil. Sorry if you're a Wiccan watching this. I don't mean to offend you. From a Christian perspective, Wicca is evil. But we do need to make a distinction between the two perspectives, okay? While Wicca and Satanism fall under the broad umbrella of non-Christian, right, often occultic or esoteric or, this kind of worldviews they are, they're not the same thing, okay? Most Wiccans will be quick to tell you that. In fact, they'll usually be offended by the suggestion that Wicca has anything to do with Satan. Wiccans explicitly deny the existence of Satan altogether. Now, again, as I mentioned before, you could make the argument that, well, it's Satan's still involved from a Christian perspective because obviously Wicca is not God-honoring and it's a form of idolatry, so on and so forth, okay? But in terms of like religious structure, religious perspective, they're They're just not the same thing, okay? Wicca is nature-centered. It focuses on harmony, balance, reverence for the natural world, so forth. Its rituals are meant to celebrate the cycles of life, death, rebirth, all that kind of stuff. It's not to invoke or worship a kind of evil being or anything like that. Now, granted, are they doing that in their rituals? Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's the implications of it, right? But in terms of a religious perspective, in terms of properly representing what they believe, you want to make those distinctions. Now, when you deal with Satanism, this is a different story altogether. And you have to make distinctions even within Satanism because there are different kinds of Satanism. There's LaVeyan Satanism, named after Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan in 1966. LaVeyan Satanism is actually, interestingly enough, atheistic, okay? It doesn't believe in a literal Satan or any supernatural beings at all. Instead, it uses Satan, the concept of Satan, as a kind of symbol, a metaphor for human pride or self-determination and rebellion against traditional religious morality, so on and so forth, right? And especially Christianity specifically. It's essentially secular humanism dressed in dark, ritualistic, Gothic clothing, okay? So very different than Wicca, although obviously we put them in the same bucket of unbelief and ultimately rooted in the enemy, okay? Then there are more theistic Satanism, forms of Satanism, which does involve a belief in a literal Satan or a spiritual being who is, maybe revered or followed or whatever. Theistic Satanists see Satan as either a misunderstood liberator, which is interesting, or an actual supernatural figure worthy of some kind of devotion. And in that sense, theistic Satanism is more overtly religious and supernatural in its orientation, while you have that other form, that LaVeyan form of Satanism, is more philosophical and human-centered. So there's a difference between them. You don't want to get them mixed up. Obviously, we know that anything that's contrary to the Word of God is going to have satanic origins, ultimately, in deception. But in terms of properly representing the perspectives, you want to make sure you allow the proponent to define their categories. And it's going to be very helpful when you're doing worldview analysis, because if you try to do an internal critique of someone's worldview, but you impose upon their worldview something that they denied or something that they don't hold to, then you're going to be accused of doing an external critique of their worldview. And if you do an external critique of their worldview, then you can't complain when they do an external critique of your worldview based upon assumptions and presuppositions that you reject. So you want to be very, very careful when you are talking to these folks. And this is anybody, not just Wicca, any religious perspective or philosophical perspective. You always, and I repeat this all the time, you always want to ask questions, okay? Questions help with clarification, and it allows someone to define their terms, define their position, and then what you want to do is the opposite of what is known as a straw man. A straw man is a fallacy when you reconstruct a person's view in its weakest form possible. In many cases, they don't hold to the thing that you've reconstructed, and then you knock down that inaccurate version of their perspective. What you want to do is you want to allow the person to explain their view and then do what we call a steel man. A steel man. You want to present your opponent's position in the strongest way possible and then offer the refutation or the reductio ad absurdum or whatever the case may be. All right? That's what in the ideal situation, that's what we're trying to do. Now, are you going to do it perfectly all the time? No. I'm not a black belt in Wicca. This is based upon my own reflection and thoughts and study and so forth. But if I were talking to a Wiccan and someone said, well, you got this part wrong, it's like, well, okay, let's talk about that. Either way, the nature of my discussion and the nature of my line of questions are going to be similar, okay? But again, we want to do our best to represent perspectives, and that opens up lines of communication. Obviously, we want to treat people with respect, whether they're a Satanist, whether they're a Wiccan, or they're in the occult. You want to show people love and respect, but firmness, and offer a strong, biblically based apologetic, okay? Do not be afraid. Do not be timid. Just because someone wears black and has black eyeliner and wears a pentagram around their neck, that doesn't make them, not human. They're human beings. They go home, they eat food, they go to the bathroom, right? They have to go to work. They're regular human beings made in the image of God, and they are objects of love. We ought to show love to those people, but also a firm apologetic with a courageous and accurate, biblically based proclamation of the gospel. Very, very important. All right, well, that is it. I hope this is useful to you. If you've listened this long, thank you so much. If you're new to Revealed Apologetics, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell like us YouTubers always say, so you can keep updated on all the videos that come out on the channel. One of my goals is to create this is to use this channel as kind of a hub for applying a biblical apologetic to literally everything, whether it's a philosophical perspective, responding to objections, different worldviews, popular views, not so popular views. What are the many different and creative ways we can apply a biblical approach to all of those things? That's what I'm trying to do, trickling in with some other topics as well. We've talked about a wide range of topics on this channel, so you guys can check the backlog there. We talk about creation debates and theological debates and so on and so forth. So we have covered a lot, but specifically we focused on the presuppositional approach. I don't think there are any other channels that do that in the same way that we do it here. Maybe there are. If there are, I'd love to see them. I'm always looking for people of kindred spirits. But the reason why I do what I do is I haven't found this kind of stuff anywhere else. So I figured, you know, we're meeting a need. It's a niche need. But it is something that many people I've heard have found it very helpful. But if you know other resources that are doing what I'm doing here and covering topics in more depth or whatever, let me know in the comments. I totally want to check those out and see what's out there. So, but nevertheless, thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate the fact that you've stayed this long. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Until next time, guys, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.